The documentary Secret Mall Apartment is a joyful story about artistic rebellion. It arrives at the perfect moment, but it was almost never told. I'm Thom Powers, and this is Pure Nonfiction. If you only know us as a podcast, I encourage you to also look for our Substack newsletter called Doc Voices, written by Bella Racklin. In recent months, we've posted extensive coverage of the Sundance and South by Southwest film festivals. We've also conducted video interviews with filmmakers to discuss the cases of the Columbia student Mahmoud Khalil, detained by ICE agents, and of Miami Beach's O Cinema that fought and won a battle for free speech. Look for Doc Voices on Substack. On this episode, I speak with Jeremy Workman, the director of Secret Mall Apartment. Here's the story. In 1999, the city of Providence, Rhode Island, opened a giant mall called Providence Place. It was an effort to revitalize the downtown, but in doing so, the developers displaced a community living there before gentrification. A group of 4 artists came up with a project to reclaim their space. In this clip, we hear from 2 of them, Michael Townsend and Adriana Valdez-Young.
Live at the mall, it seemed like a very absurd fantasy and a great way to plow through all of the negativity that had been built up for years in the loss of our homes and the homes of hundreds of people. And so Adriana and Andrew and Jay and myself decided that we would go live there for at least 1 week.
It was more of a game of survival. Who was gonna get kicked out from security and who was gonna last the longest? And I think we were making bets about it. I definitely thought that I was gonna live there the longest.
Their project evolved from just 1 week when they found a neglected space deep in the mall's infrastructure. The group of 4 artists grew to 8. They created their own living space and occupied it for 4 years. In 2007, the secret was discovered by mall security. Michael Townsend took the blame, and the other 7 members of the group never spoke about it publicly until this film. Secret Mall Apartment made its debut at South by Southwest last year and played widely at other festivals. I spoke with Jeremy last Thursday, just before the film was set to open theatrically at the very mall where it takes place. Jeremy has made several previous documentaries, including The World Before Your Feet, about a man who set out to walk every New York City street, and Lily Topples the World, about a young woman who creates elaborate sequences of falling dominoes. Jeremy also has a day job editing movie trailers. You've probably seen his work without knowing it. You could say that Jeremy was born to do this because his father is also a documentary maker and an editor. I started by asking Jeremy how that influenced him.
I grew up in Los Angeles. My father is a filmmaker. His name is Chuck Workman. He was making documentaries and is a great editor, just an incredible editor, innovative, very much sort of a maverick at the time in Los Angeles. There were not a lot of documentary filmmakers in Los Angeles. When he kind of landed there and started making films, he made some really wonderful documentaries in the 80s and 90s. He made one on Andy Warhol called Superstar. He made one on the Beat Generation called The Source. So it was incredible, growing up in and being sort of under that. First of all, there's not a whole lot of second generation documentary filmmakers of us out there amongst our colleagues and peers. So it was just really incredible. I learned so much. I learned about editing, storytelling. I learned about what it means to try to make a documentary, to how to do it, to kind of the challenges. I also learned a lot about craft, making a living as a documentary filmmaker, but also being able to have other skills to make a living. It's very difficult, as we all know, as tons of your guests have probably said on your show. It's very difficult to be a documentary filmmaker and make a living. So I sort of was able to experience all that and see that and the ups and downs. It wasn't always, a great ride. It wasn't always easy for our family and whatnot, but he really just kind of, was making really unique films, and that absolutely inspired me. So that by the time I got to college, I mean, I really had no interest other than kind of doing this stuff, making documentaries, being an editor. And I think I started being a professional editor as my first job out of college. And, without a doubt, I sort of had a leg up for just to be able to kind of, experience that at such a young age. But I think it also kind of gave me an understanding of like almost like how hard the work was going to be as a career. So I think that was also really important, just to kind of know that, okay, I would have to lean in and really go after it, and to make a living and make a go at it.
So, I mean, that's so interesting. I mean, you're kind of indicating that you had witnessed some struggles in your father's career.
Yeah, he was always, he, like I said, he made great films. He also is a very innovative editor, and I think I got that maybe as much as anything from him. He was really doing kind of radical editing in terms of montage. A lot of people sort of knew his name because he was doing a lot of the, the famous people montages that would pop up like on the Oscar shows. And so it kind of, again, it kind of reinforced this notion of like, really honing your craft and being, that filmmaking, especially making documentaries, it's not the glamour business. It is, something where you really have to kind of hone your skills and hone your craft. But yeah, he was always kind of, chasing after documentaries, raising funding, trying to get movies going. And he made a number of really great films, but would always figure out angles to make them. Sometimes there would be budget to make something, really sort of splashy like his Andy Warhol film, but other times he had no budget and they would just, figure out who could bring a camera around and do some stuff, and he would just sort of edit that on the side and on home computers. So I was always exposed to that, and I think that's probably the big takeaway that I took as a filmmaker, just this kind of relentless kind of creative urge to kind of always be kind of doing stuff. It's not always about like making something splashy or big. It's just about always, putting in the work and doing the best you can with whatever you have.
Well, I mean, that gives me a fresh perspective on this, on one aspect of your career, which is that in addition to making documentaries, you edit trailers. I mean, you're one of the go-to trailer editors in New York City. Before I talk about your film, I would love to hear a little bit, get some insights into what you've learned editing trailers, because I think a lot of filmmakers think for at least a minute, like, oh, I can edit the trailer of my own film, and then quickly realize that that's a different craft.
Oh, yeah. It's such a different craft. I joke that editing trailers, one of my go-to analogies, it's like doing calligraphy. It's just this weird, skill set that like sort of has no purpose other than just for this one thing. It's not writing, it's not drawing, it's calligraphy. You know what I mean? It's just so bizarre. But yes, there's probably a lot of your listeners that are like, oh, wait, I know Jeremy. I've worked with him as trailers, doing trailers. And, I feel like my career has been really interesting, especially of late, where it's kind of like, my filmmaking is kind of, overtaking that a little bit. But, for really my whole adult life, I've been a trailer editor. To be honest with you, it might be the only really paying job I've ever had. I started editing trailers right out of college. I was recruited by the one company in New York that does Hollywood movie trailers, and I found myself like in my early 20s editing trailers for Hollywood movies, and these were big movies, movies with like directors like, Tarantino and Tim Burton and Scorsese. And I worked on the Matrix campaigns. And, I wasn't the sole editor, but I was like one of several of the editors that were like working on those movies. And then I guess when I started to kind of make my own documentaries and just kind of the process of kind of, getting a little burnt out on Hollywood stuff, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to start doing trailers for the indie world in New York. And then I started a company with my business partner, Rob Lyons, and we've had Wheelhouse Creative now for like over a decade. And I've worked on, I mean, literally like hundreds of trailers, and very much many of them documentaries, and we also work on things like sizzles and fundraising pieces and reels and posters. And now we're even kind of branching out and doing a lot of like sort of movie marketing shooting. And so it's just, very busy. Trailers have been incredibly sort of important for me in terms of first of all, being able to like make a living, so that's really, something I think about. I wasn't fortunate enough to be able to like not have to make a living. I have to make a living. So I always was sort of working on that craft and trying to get better and better and kind of understand the landscape. And it also, I think, has been really, really helpful in terms of thinking about story, compressing story, being comfortable with disparate elements that come into a story and how to kind of construct. I mean, this kind of sounds reductive, but how to construct stories in 3-act structures and, narrative arcs. And I think that all that has informed my own filmmaking in just leaps and bounds, just constantly. I think that being able to kind of use those muscles of editing and compression and thinking about how to what is the best part of material, has been so helpful in like everything I've been doing.
My last question about trailers is, when you're working with filmmakers, is there a common misunderstanding that filmmakers have about trailers, or a common surprise that they have about what you've done with their film?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the kind of the running joke that a lot of filmmakers would cop to is that, directors are not great at making trailers. They really are not, because, they're seeing their movie through a certain prism, and they're, suddenly we're taking that and we're like shredding their movie into just like, core elements, into raw materials, and then sort of reconstructing it. And it's like this really, it's this complex process, but it's also like kind of unsettling. So you have to be very, you have to be tough on your material. You have to be tough on yourself. And I do think that it's very difficult for directors to kind of make trailers on their own work. It's even hard for me, having so much experience doing trailers, when I'm suddenly like, okay, now I'm doing a trailer for my own movie. So I think that, I would encourage directors who work with any trailer editor, to kind of like embrace the process, to rely on outside voices and outside ears, and even ask people, for their takes. Trailers are they're kind of like something that should be seen by audiences, so it's not something for a filmmaker to have something that's like cool for them to, show around. It's for the public, and therefore it has different, kind of stresses and pressures on it that the film doesn't. And, we're always trying to do whatever we can to get people to get excited about movies, and particularly documentary films. And sometimes it's not easy. So we kind of go into it really with our, trying to do the best we can. And we work very closely with directors and the filmmaking team. But we also want to encourage everybody to be very collaborative in that part of the process, because it's a weird process.
All right, let's get into Secret Mall Apartment. As I watched the film, I was trying to imagine how you got into this. I thought maybe you had read a story about it, but then I learned from your press kit that the way you learned about this story is that you randomly met the artist Michael Townsend, who is at the center of the film. Can you tell me about that meeting and how you came to learn about this whole story?
Yeah, so the story is really bonkers. It's about, these 8 people in Rhode Island in the early 2000s, from 2003 to 2007. A gigantic mall moves into downtown Providence, and I'm sure listeners know this mall. It's the Providence Place Mall. It was the biggest construction project in the history of Rhode Island. It just was this massive, massive, building that, of course, was like, development gone to hell and just gentrification gone wild. And it displaced so many people in this neighborhood of downtown Providence. Now, these 8 people, they were kind of mad about this. They didn't know what to do. They were trying to sort of take a stand, and they snuck into the mall, and they found this space that was like the size of, about 1,000 square foot. And they decided, in some kind of like crazy idea of occupying an unoccupied space and being developers themselves, they would build a secret apartment, which they kept going for 4 years. And they were able to hide it from security and go in and out and do all kinds of bonkers stuff. So this was urban legend. This was like a story out of Providence that like a lot of people knew and became sort of, city legend for many, many people. I had never heard this. I knew nothing about this. I'm not from Providence. As I mentioned, I grew up in Los Angeles and didn't know this story at all. But I was in, Athens, Greece, and I was filming for my another documentary, Lily Topples the World. And that's the documentary about Lily Hevish, who's the world's greatest domino toppler. And I was out there, and the building that Lily was doing this massive domino artwork was covered in masking tape art. And for those that'll see the movie, Michael Townsend, the main subject and the main ringleader of the Secret Mall Apartment, is also like the world's only the most foremost. I don't even know how to describe it, but he's like the greatest tape artist on planet
So maybe
Earth.
we should just describe what this is. So by masking tape, it's not like the beige tape that you might pack boxes in. It's more like the colored tape that you would use if you're painting.
Yeah, like painter's tape.
Like painter's tape. So it's blue and green tape, and he uses it like a painter uses a paintbrush, like to create shapes and outlines and figures and kind of fanciful.
It's incredible. Yeah. I mean, it's really amazing. It's like these whimsical, just murals that he does with tape. And he's sort of the pioneer of this. And it really connects with him as an artist because he's very interested in temporary art. He's interested in public art. And he loves this sort of active collaboration that he often brings people in to work with tape art. So anyway, I'm like in the middle of Greece, and this building was covered with incredible tape art. And having made films about, quirky, weird artists in my past, I was like, I need to meet whoever did this tape art. Turned out to be Michael Townsend. We became friends instantly. And over the course of several days, a couple drunk nights, he told me that he, in the early 2000s had lived secretly in this secret apartment in Providence. And he told me all about it. And he showed me footage that, within just a couple weeks of knowing him, he starts showing me footage of them pushing, furniture up through the mall, sneaking it in and making this apartment into like a real living space. I was totally blown away. As you can imagine, what was interesting was Michael and everybody involved, they weren't interested in doing a documentary. they had no interest in that. And they had gone 17 years resisting, overtures from other filmmakers who wanted to do the documentary on this. And they just kept on saying, no, no, no. And for whatever reason, maybe because we connected, maybe because, I had a interesting approach, he and the 7 other artists decided, okay, the time was now to do this documentary.
So let's talk about the footage that they had, because you describe it a little bit in the film. The camera that they were shooting on was a kind of low res. In the film, they described it as a low res camera, but your deployment of the footage in the film, I wouldn't call it high res, but it's perfectly usable.
Yeah. So when they were in the secret apartment, they lived there and were able to keep it going for 4 years. And there were 8 of them. And over that 4 years, they filmed a ton of footage. Okay, well, maybe ton is actually an overstatement. They filmed 24 to 25 hours of footage. And, obviously there's a lot of, everybody who is probably listening to this knows a lot about documentaries, I'm sure. And we all know that, sometimes archival can be in the hundreds of hours. This was 25 hours. So that was a great amount of footage. But it also, it had limitations. The other big issue with it is they shot with consumer cameras that they literally bought at Radio Shack for, $100. And these cameras shot 320 by 240, 10 frames a second. So this is worse. This is like maybe a quarter the quality of VHS. Technically it's like half VHS, but it's really because of it was compressed. It was in this weird format. And they had these tiny cameras that they kind of smuggled through the mall, and they filmed everything. And again, they were doing it because they're artists and they had just kind of this tendency to record everything, but it wasn't really for any purpose of anyone seeing it beyond themselves. And this footage sort of sat in hard drives and in a vault for, nearly 2 decades.
But someone had paid enough attention to keep it viable on a hard drive. I spent 10 years as a professional filmmaker. I'd be chagrined to go back to try to find something that that I shot 25 years ago.
Yeah, they had it on, a couple of them had it on hard drive. One of the artists just had a bunch of SD cards in his attic, and another one still had the camera and it still worked, and the SD card was still in it, and it had footage of the secret apartment. So they made all this incredible effort to film it. And when I say film it, they film them sneaking furniture in. They film them, building the apartment. They film them dodging in and out of security, timing the alarms. They film themselves at the food court.
No, it's really filmed as if you had the intention to make a documentary.
Yeah, it's incredible. And also, since they're artists, really all of them are accomplished artists in their own way. It was just incredible coverage. Suddenly you're like, wow, this camera angle is incredible. So it was just amazing how great it was.
So it's important to note here that Michael Townsend was the kind of ringleader of this group. It comes across in the film, and when the apartment was exposed in 2007, he was the face of the operation.
Yeah, and the fall guy.
And the other 7 people who were part of it, you convey in the film, had never really been exposed in the last 17 years. So tell me about the process of, convincing this whole group, who you said a few minutes ago had rejected other people, interest in making a documentary. How did you corral everyone to get involved?
I think this is like sort of an underrated aspect of documentary filmmaking. And in some ways it doesn't get talked about enough, which is the process of convincing real people to be in a movie, and it's a real part of making documentaries. And you have to really be, passionate, obviously, diligent. You got to come with your ideas. You got to come kind of prepared for conversations and dialogues. And I think I've been lucky on a number of films now to find subjects who maybe wouldn't say yes typically to a documentary. And in some ways that has made them special. I made a film, The World Before Your Feet, which is about Matt Green walking every street of New York City. He also just had turned down a number of filmmakers. So just that process of kind of finding subjects that could work for a documentary, but also then engaging them as, on this human level as to how that process is going to be and why you're the person to make that film, I think is a really important part of making documentaries. In the case of these 8, they were, besides The Secret Apartment, like when you hear The Secret Apartment, it sounds like the greatest prank in the history of, pranks. I mean, it's incredible. Like they live in a busy mall and they're just, they're eating at the food court and going to the movie theater and just doing just bonkers stuff for 4 years and not getting caught. However, it also was, these were 8 artists who were doing really, really interesting things at the same time they were in The Secret Apartment. And they were, for example, they were going into hospitals, into children's wards in hospitals and doing artwork for cancer patients, for children. And they were doing that voluntarily, and they weren't getting paid, and they weren't looking for any notoriety. They were doing 9/11 memorials. They were doing tape art again through the city of New York for all the victims of 9/11. They were doing memorials for the OKC bombings that happened in the 90s.
In Oklahoma City, if people don't get the OKC reference.
Exactly. So they were also doing these really interesting public artworks that were kind of bandit and guerrilla, and not a lot of people knew about it. So it was this incredible irony and, this interesting part of the story that here are these 8 who were being kind of, portrayed as these like pranksters, were also doing these very humanitarian, charitable, very noble and interesting artwork on the side. And I found that so fascinating. I sort of saw like kind of like as they felt that The Secret Apartment had a lot of like sort of cross currents with this other stuff that they were doing. That when they were going into the hospitals to do tape art, they were actually planning those in The Secret Apartment. They were working on this kind of art in The Secret Apartment. And so many filmmakers, I think, had gone to them and just were really interested in the, sensational kind of New York Post side of this story. So I think my pitch was, which I was so fascinated by, was that it was this bigger story about them as, as artists, as people who were protesting. And The Secret Apartment was just sort of this one aspect of this bigger story that was encompassed them. And maybe that was why they said yes to me. I could imagine it probably was.
Given that 7 of these people had never been public about their involvement in something quasi illegal, I don't know that there was any, legal threat hanging over their head, because as far as crimes go, it seems like a pretty harmless one.
No one got hurt.
But did anyone have some reluctance to put their name to this?
Yeah. There was, of the 8, I'd say 3 of them were not that interested in being in the documentary. And ultimately, we got them all. And I think it has sometimes when you are working on something that's about something in the past, people in the present maybe don't want to be associated with it, or they've moved on, or, in this case, these were artists who had done incredible stuff in the last 20 years and maybe I'm guessing, maybe didn't want to be associated with this thing that a lot of people just saw as this prank when they hear it. But by talking to subjects and kind of really hearing their story, I think they all felt comfortable that, okay, this movie would be something that would try to go to deeper places, for better or worse. I'm sure there's going to be people who are like, oh, I wish this was a movie that just, was just about this stunt the whole time. But for me, what I was interested in was, going to these deeper places, and maybe that helped convince them.
Yeah, I'd be surprised to meet the person who would want it just to be about the stunt, because I think the real strength of the film, and something I wasn't really expecting when I read the log line of the film, is just how layered it is. And I want to, you talked before about how much you learned about pacing and structure as you developed your film career. And I felt very conscious of that watching this film, the way things are revealed to me in the film. And I'll give just one example. So, early in the film, we see your interview with Michael Townsend, and he's interviewed in what kind of looks like a warehouse space with stacks of masking tape behind him. And I remember thinking early in the film, like, before I knew that he was an artist who worked with masking tape, it's like, oh, this is an interesting choice of a setup. Like, I wonder, does this guy, have a day job at, working in a shipping department, and then, lo and behold, not early in the film, feels to me like kind of in the middle of the film is when you go deeper into what he does, and it's not like a gimmick reveal, but it's a reveal the way we often experience as we get to know someone. We get to know someone, they make a strong first impression on us, and then the more we talk to them, things become more interesting if they're an interesting person about their life. And I felt like I had that experience several times in this film. So I'd like to ask you about the deliberateness with, which you were constructing. There's lots of different things that happen in this film, and you had to figure out the order of how to place them.
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. It is something that I think about a lot. Yes. And I think this has to do with a few things that I think about. Again, since my background is in editing, I'm thinking a lot when I'm constructing about, kind of setups and payoffs, setups and payoffs, setups and payoffs. And in some ways, I don't know if that's more like something that is more like in the scripted fiction world, that when we see scripted films, there's so much that's set up in the first act and it's paid off in the second and third act. And, this is something that I think about. And I don't know where, maybe I get that just from, being very interested in movies, and not just documentaries. Obviously, I watch a ton of documentaries, but I also, I think a lot of my thinking about my own films, I'm trying to sort of look at scripted movies sometimes. I was joking, and this is a joke, but I was joking that the biggest influence for Secret Mall Apartment was Ferris Bueller's Day Off, But I very much think about how to engage an audience so that an audience, if they're, I think about audience a lot, and I don't think that's pandering. I don't think that's, thinking about audience, we shouldn't be doing that. I think that, when you're asking somebody to watch a movie for 90 minutes and watch your movie, you're sort of forming this like little covenant with them where you are demanding a lot of time with them, and that experience should be something that is rewarding and a great experience and surprising. So I'm sort of always kind of thinking in that way when I'm editing. Maybe that comes from trailers. I don't know. Maybe that just comes from the kind of experiences that I've really enjoyed in the movie theater, where things are always surprising. And and this is a story also where you're watching it and you go in thinking kind of like what we've already touched on. You go in thinking like, oh, okay, this is going to be a prank movie. And then it just kind of keeps surprising you and surprising you as you go. And I love that. I mean, I know there's lots of filmmakers that kind of do that kind of strategy, which I guess is like like a Trojan horse kind of thing. I sort of say like, well, what I love about making movies is this idea that a viewer is going to come in one door, and then when they leave the movie, they exit another door. And it's sort of like this idea that, again, like you're coming, this experience continues to be enriching as you go and surprising. So sometimes it is, as you mentioned, sometimes it is about withholding information, saving some information for different parts of the narrative arc. And some of this is pretty kind of technical mumbo jumbo. Some filmmakers might be like, no, you're somehow breaching some truth, or who knows. But I sort of feel like movies, whether it's a documentary or not, it's an experience for a viewer, and that's something that I think is very important. And I try to think about that in anything I do, and whether it's for 2 minutes or whether it's for 90 minutes.
So this is the second film where Jesse Eisenberg has been involved as an executive producer after The World Before Your Feet. Can you tell me more about that relationship and how he got involved with this one?
Jesse's been a friend of mine, and he and I met, just kind of randomly in New York. We had mutual friends. I was on set of a movie he did called The End of the Tour, and we just kind of connected. And then he, it was just somebody who, like, we have a lot of kind of similar kind of mindset. We both like the same kind of stuff. We both feel like it's fun to be silly and like stupid stuff too sometimes. And he was an EP on The World Before Your Feet, and he really enjoyed that process. It was really fun because that movie came out and got like a pretty great like theatrical release. It was released with Greenwich, and it was in, maybe like 100 cities, 80 cities. But like, I remember we released at the Quad in New York, and Jesse was like at 25 Q&As,
Wow.
which was just kind of astonishing, and I think he maybe felt like this was just sort of a fun thing. He didn't have to like, shill his own work, or kind of, that it was like fun for him, that side of the experience. So when I was working on Secret Mall Apartment, I was showing him footage, and he just was like, oh my God, this is so amazing. And this story is so interesting. And he got involved very early on it. I didn't realize at the time, but he had this very personal connection to Providence as well. When he was in Providence filming a movie as an actor, and he had to live in this building that was called the 903. And it's right next to the mall. And it is one of these like horrible gentrification nightmares that was literally built, over the grounds of like these incredible mill buildings that they demolished when the mall came in. So he like had this like really personal experience that was very similar to, the experience of the people in this story. And he's been great, and continues to this day, loves doing Q&As. He's going to be at a lot of our Q&As at the IFC Center, and has been like such a champion.
I'm talking to you on Thursday before the film is going to open in Providence at the Providence Place Mall. Can you talk about your relationship to the mall? I don't know how the mall looks back on this history, if it's changed over the years from the time in which they were, kicking these these artists out of their space. Michael Townsend, it says in the film, has been banned from the mall all these years. So. Tell me about how any interactions that you've had with the official mall institution.
Yeah, I mean, it's also just this crazy coda to this whole story as well, which is the mall has become like this, embracing this documentary in such a way. When we were making the documentary, I was extremely nervous about the mall, and I was.
That's a big location release to think about.
I was worried about those, like maybe the 3 worst words in documentary filmmaking. I was worried about cease and desist. I was worried about that the mall's lawyers would be coming after us and they would cease and desist this whole project. And it was something that I was very nervous about, and we lawyered up and we brought in like an incredible team of lawyers who protected it. And, it kind of protected the project. They had filmed all this footage. They were technically trespassing when they filmed the footage. The mall, so we were very sensitive to that, and we just kind of kept on going. We brought, like I said, on this legal team to protect us, but it was always something I was fraught. It was fraught, and I was always a little nervous. So over the course of the film's, own history, the mall starts really struggling, and it is still struggling, the Providence Place Mall, and it has now.
Well, let's just talk about that for a minute. Like, this mall opens in 1999, which feels like the worst timing to open a major shopping mall, just before the era of online shopping is about to explode.
Yeah. Oh, totally. So it comes into this town, and it's supposed to revitalize Providence. That was the whole idea. And a lot of people associate malls with the suburbs. This is one of the rare malls that was in the middle of a downtown. So its aim was that it was just going to revitalize the whole city. And then instantly it was struggling. It is not a dead mall. It is still very much very active. It still does okay. But over the last 17, 18 years, and even more so, it's gone from kind of being, this kind of powerhouse in the city to now, like many malls, just kind of struggling. And it's gone through owners. And then while we were making the film, it went into essentially it kind of defaulted on its mortgage, went into bankruptcy, changed ownerships again and again, and now is in receivership, which, by the way, I had no idea what receivership means, but I learned, about 6 months ago, and I was like, oh, okay, that's interesting. So it's essentially like forced bankruptcy. And now they're trying desperately to kind of keep it going, bring in foot traffic, find a new buyer. And what's so interesting and so fascinating is that the movie has now become almost embraced by this new group, and we've embraced the mall, almost like we all sort of feel like it's an opportunity for us to kind of help each other and share in each other's success. So the mall is opening the film this weekend, and it apparently, I'm already hearing it's could have one of the highest per screen averages for a documentary since the pandemic. And it's being really embraced by the community of Providence. And the mall's like, look, we're desperate for foot traffic, and we really feel like this story is part of our legacy and it's part of our community, and we're all in. So they've been sort of suddenly become incredible partners for our release, which is this kind of ultimate irony that I'm still trying to process in my mind.
So when was the moment that happened? I mean, you went from that being your biggest fear, how the mall would react, to this very 180-degree attitude towards it. But when did you have to finally reach out and say, hey, Mr. Mall, we've got this film?
I mean, it was after the movie started playing at festivals. And the movie was at festivals and it was getting a lot of attention and it was winning awards. And I was like, I wonder what the mall's thinking. And then while I was wondering that, I would read these articles online that were like, oh, the Providence Place Mall, sold again. And then, and I'd be like, oh, wow, should we reach out to them now? And then like 2 weeks later, it'd be an article about the mall is now, being run by this receivership company and they're, it may go out of business. And it was just kind of like happening as we were starting to exhibit the film. Again, when we first released the film at festivals, so we premiered at South by, I was like, we don't need to involve the mall right now. We're all covered. Everything's fine. And then little by little, I started realizing like it wasn't the same big bad villain that I had imagined in my head. And it's one of those kind of interesting kind of side trails that happen on these journeys of these films where like you just did not expect it at all. So we're super excited. The mall is like in rolling out the red carpet for this documentary, and they're thrilled, and we are really doing our part to try to do as best as we can to help have people like go to the mall, go to the food court before the movie, and make it a whole night at the mall.
So for my last question, this group of 8 artists who are at the center of this film. For many years, they had no interest in a documentary being made. Now this documentary is out there. What have you witnessed amongst them as what it means to have the story told?
I think they feel great, because they feel like they've been really heard in terms of what they are about as artists and human beings, that they, all these things that they were doing are part of this story. And also, the movie has a couple other neat tricks up its sleeve where the subjects are also kind of participating in the movie itself. And you sort of watch that in this kind of meta way where some of the subjects are even involved in the process of the movie you're watching. And I think that, it was the right approach because kind of, understanding, I think for a lot of filmmakers might be able to relate to this, that, when the movie's done, a lot of times the subjects who are really, nervous and apprehensive about the process, it's very cathartic and they feel great, even if it's showing things that they don't really feel comfortable about in public, but that it feels like that they've gone through the process with you and they understand it and they feel better, for it. And I think that has happened quite a bit with this project as well. All the 8 artists are now, huge supporters of the movie and doing all the Q&A, and they all feel like they were heard. So I think that's, another aspect of just making documentaries is making sure that, subjects feel heard.
I want to thank Jeremy Workman for speaking with me. His film Secret Mall Apartment opens this weekend at New York's IFC Center and rolls out in theaters across the country. I invite you to read our Substack newsletter, Doc Voices, written by Bella Racklin. If you want to advertise to our 45,000 readers, send an email to listen@purenonfiction.net. Thanks to our team, series producer Hannah Nordenswan and web designer Cross Strategy. Our theme music is composed by Andre Williams, and our executive producer is Raphael Nahausen. I'm Thom Powers. Follow us on Instagram and visit our website at purenonfiction.net.